Okay, hello everyone. Sorry, start with some technical difficulties, but welcome to the first session of the series Contributorcast for Apache TinkerPop. So this is where we invite the TinkerPop contributors to come in and talk about the features they've implemented. Now we hope for this to be a casual and fun knowledge sharing series. So yeah, today we brought some of the contributors, and we're going to chat about some of the new updates that came onto the 3.5.5 and 3.62 release. So let's start with a round of introductions. So I'll start with myself. So my name is Yang. I've been a contributor on TinkerPop for just over a year. I was more recently, I became a committer on Apache TinkerPop, and it was the first time, so I was release manager for 3.5.5 and 3.6.2, and it was an interesting first time experience for me. So yeah, happy to be here. I'll pass it down to Ken.
Hey everyone, I'm Ken. I'm also a recent contributor to Apache TinkerPop. Mostly just been contributing some fixes to the Gremlin server and some minor stuff to the GLVs. Yeah, I'll pass it off to Cole.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me here. I'm Cole. I've been a contributor to Apache TinkerPop for about 5 months now. The biggest contributions I've worked on is adding ARM support and the user agent to the drivers, which is something we'll talk about later today. So I'll pass off to Valentyn now.
Hi all, my name is Valentyn. I'm contributing to TinkerPop for a year. I started my contributor path with implementing some minor features for different GLVs, for Go, Python, and other. And now I'm mostly focused on developing of server core features, and I will describe this later. And I would like to hand back to Yang.
Okay, thank you everyone. So let's just get right into it. So here's a quick overview of what we're going to do today. So to start us off, Cole will be talking about the stuff he had implemented for us. So the user agent support and the ARM support, which I'm sure some of you would have liked that. So I'll be talking about some of the new vMerge updates. The Dockerized test environment that's introduced to the developers, the no host available exceptions, which Ken will be talking about, and the timeout exceptions, a huge improvement for driver. Also Valentyn, who will be giving us a brief sneak peek at the 3.7 features. And we welcome all the questions, so if you have any, put them in the comments, but we'll be addressing them at the end. So yeah, thank you. We'll get started. I'll hand it off to Cole.
All right, thanks. So yeah, I wanted to start off here by talking about the default user agent, which we've added to TinkerPop 3.5.5 and 3.6.2. So the user agent we've added here, it's composed of the driver name and version, the language runtime version, the operating system name and version, the CPU architecture, and the application name. So we tried to make sure that we weren't going to include any sensitive information in here, but of course, if any user doesn't want to share this, they can just easily disable the user agent. There's just a little configuration option, and TinkerPop will function exactly as it always has without sending any of this. So want to make sure that's an option for everybody. So we believe this data is going to be useful for admins and providers to better align their priorities to their user base. We also hope that the user agent is going to speed up diagnosing different issues which are specific to single GLVs. And we also think that this is going to be helpful in terms of identifying issues that only exist if you're mismatching different client and server versions. Also, having the default user agent, it's going to unlock the possibility for the server to adjust its responses based on which type of client it's connecting to it. An example of what we might want to do here is if we've got a newer server version and there's older clients connecting to it, the server could adjust its responses to leave out any new features that the clients are missing. As of right now, though, the server is just keeping a pretty simple metric to track what sort of clients are connecting. And we're excited to see what we could use this data for in the future as we go along. And we'll jump to the next slide here. Yeah. So the other change I want to talk about here today is one's quite close to my heart as an ARM user myself. You've ever tried to run TinkerPop on ARM before, you know there's occasionally been some road bumps there. But yeah, happy to share here that as of 3.5.5 and 3.6.2, all the TinkerPop components will just run out of the box just fine on ARM. So one of the changes we've had to do to enable this is all of our Docker files for Gremlin server and console. We've changed those so they're no longer using any x86 only base images. So now the Docker images can be built for ARM. Unfortunately, the images published on Docker Hub for convenience are still x86 only. That's something we need to amend in our release process. We're going to look to get that resolved soon. But for now, any ARM user can just build and use their ARM images for Gremlin console and server with just a simple Maven install. The other issue we addressed here is that if you've ever tried to use Gremlin console on ARM before, you'll know that it's out of the box. It was missing some key dependencies, and you'd have to manually add some extra libraries to it to make it run. That's been addressed now. Those are bundled in, so you can just download and run the console without any issues on ARM now. So yeah, really excited about having that all working. Now I'll pass it off to Yang to talk about some of the improvements to the merge E and merge V steps in 3.6.2.
Okay, thank you, Ko. Yeah, so these merge V and merge E updates was implemented by Mike Personic, who couldn't be here with us today. So I'll just take my best at briefly introducing these changes. So these improvement to the semantics was based on user feedbacks. So that outlined in the upgrade documentations, the three major changes to improve the usability includes, so the onCreate map, it will no longer override the existing criteria. So instead, it will inherit anything from the main merge argument, and it will serve as a method to allow user to add additional specifications. So one of the biggest changes is that we've added two additional options. So InV and OutV into merge. So you can now specify direction in and out, and which accept both map or traversal arguments. And as a result, merge E will no longer accept upstream vertices as the arguments for direction in and out, not specified in the map arguments. So they will come from the merge InV and merge OutV option modulators instead. And so what that looks like, so I have a quick example to show. So basically, if you look on the above, so for the 3.6.1, so for merge E steps to be successful, so you needed the vertices to exist. So previously, you have to create the vertices using g.mergev or any other vertex creation methods, and then you specify that into the from and to using their index, their ID. So now with the InV and OutV and InV options, what you can do is you can actually merge the two steps together. So instead of having three separate queries, as you can see, you can now just specify them all in one query. So we can see that this new option will provide additional flexibility. So yeah, and for additional information, just feel free to check out the merge steps under the reference documentations. And now, so another major change, this is especially for the developers, will be the Dockerized testing environment. So since this release of 3.5.5 and 3.6.2, we have incorporated Docker into our build system and testing system for each of the language GLVs, now which has made Docker a system requirement for developers. Now, our motivations for using the Docker is that we wanted to, so previously, the way the GLVs test integration tests is they use Groovy script to run the test server, and then they connect. And also, in addition, the users actually had to set up the environments for each GLV, each of the Gremlin variants. So say I'm a Java developer and I want to run the GLVs, then I'll have to set up a Python environment. I'll have to set up my .NET environment. And it could be cumbersome for new contributors to come on and try to set that up. So our motivation was to just, let's make it platform agnostic. Let's put everything into a Docker container. So, when the new user come and they can just run Maven clean install and everything will run. So one thing that we wanted, also another thing regarding the Groovy script. So if you have your environments that's not set up, then we use the .glv profile activation. So what this is, it's part of the Maven clean install. So it requires a file just called .glv and an empty file. And that will allow the Maven to know that, oh, okay, so you've got your environment set up. If I run Maven install, I will build and run the tests for the GLVs. So our hope is to remove that in the future, because now with Docker, your environment should be set up within Docker. So that is a change we'd like to introduce likely in the next major version update, like 3.7. So right now, we still require .glv profile activation. But yeah, that's something we hope to remove in the future, because I might forget to add a GLV and then think all my tests have passed, but it actually didn't. So another thing is we want to make sure that, so with this, no need to set up different environments. So if I'm someone, say I'm a server or core developer, then with the Docker, I can just run everything, all the GLVs in Docker without setting up the environment. So now I can test my changes with all the integration tests to server and see if all my GLV changes have, if all my tests pass still. And if I were a client developer, then I may not want to build everything. Maybe I just want to test my Python GLV against the server. So previously, if we use the Groovy script, you have to build the test server. And now with Docker, we allow people to use you can just pull the image, and then you'll just use the image to build the test server. And how that actually look like, I will show you on this slide. So basically what happens is when the Docker, so we have two separate Docker containers. So one container is a test image. So you will pull a Gremlin server image either from Docker Hub, the published one, or you can build the snapshot that is built locally. So it will pull that image and then create a test server image, and that will launch 3 instances of the server for testing. So one is no authorization, one is base authorization, and one is with Kerberos authorization. And then we have the language-specific images. So the GLV containers will then build the GLVs, test them, and then give the coverage output. And so there was actually just some development hurdles and decisions along the way. So when we first, the idea was great. So when we were implementing the Go GLV, that's what we began with. So we put the Go GLV in the Docker, and we're like, oh, we think it's a good idea to extend it to all the other language variants. It turns out not all the languages are as simple as Go in set up the testing. So for example, Python, you build and then you test, and there's the packaging. And then for .NET, we have, the source .NET, we have the .NET test projects. So that was something which we had to make a decision between, okay, do we want to just the Docker for testing, or do we want to include build and test in it? And then it turned out to be like a different decision based on the GLVs. So for example, for .NET, right now, the source .NET project, it's the building of .NET is not Dockerized, but the test project is. And then but for Python, both build and test is in the Dockerized container. So in the future, what we want to do is Dockerize everything. But at this current time, there's a slight difference. But and another thing we ran into is Docker in Docker. So if you are a developer, you might have used the convenient bash script that can build everything. Basically, you'll just run Maven clean install in a Docker environment. So that was another way. If you didn't want to just run Maven clean install, you could just run that script. So when we put everything into Docker, now that script, which runs a Docker and launches Maven clean install, now with our change, we'll launch a Docker inside that Docker. So it goes into this unfortunate problem, Docker in Docker. So we had to essentially rewrite that script. So now it does things separately. So there are certain sections it will run within a Docker, and then it will run these GLV tests separately. And another problem we encountered with user permissions. So I think if you've worked with Docker Compose and Docker settings, Docker, it assumes there's roles you can get the Docker Compose to, or the Docker file to assume. And sometimes, on different, if you have different system settings, you may require sudo permission to do certain operation. So that was one thing we encountered and had to do some interesting operations to change ownership in certain scripts. And so we foresee future issues with this potentially, but if any of you developers out there encounter any issues, feel free to raise the PR, raise the Jira, let us know. But yeah, so that is the journey in Dockerizing all this. If you have any questions, feel free to pop it in the comments, and yeah, we'll take a look at the end. Now I will hand it over to Ken.
Thanks, Yang. So if you're a frequent user of the Java driver and you work with a remote Gremlin provider or just a remote instance of the Gremlin server, then you've probably seen this no host available exception. Hopefully we've made some changes in 3.5.5 and 3.6.2 to sort of address this. So if we move to the next slide, let's talk about some of the reasons why you might see the no host available exception. So there's actually a few possible things that can trigger it, but the underlying reason is mostly due to the fact of sort of how the driver decides whether or not the host is available. And if you take a look at the code on the left, so previously when a connection couldn't be made, what happens is that host is immediately considered as unavailable if even just a single connection cannot be created. So even if there was just a temporary issue and the next connection attempt would have succeeded, it doesn't matter. This host is already marked as unavailable. However, if you take a look at the code on the right, you'll notice this has changed in 3.5.5 and 3.6.2. So now a host must have all of its connections marked as unavailable before the entire host is marked as unavailable. So this means that those sort of temporary issues or transient network issues or just those things are unlikely to cause an NHA now, or an NHA-like exception. So if we move to the next slide, this is a situation here on the left that you might have noticed before, where you're just sort of flooded with NHAs. This was a sort of a bit of a common occurrence before with NHA because of that same sort of functionality of how the driver was immediately marked, or sorry, not the driver, but that host was immediately marked as unavailable. So to give a little more information, how the driver reconnects, it does it on a background thread. And so if you submitted a lot of queries in between the time that the driver is able to reconnect to the host and the host being marked as unavailable, then you'll just immediately get a NHA as soon as you submitted a query. And so if you had a bunch of queries, you would just get this sort of flood of NHAs. This sort of behavior has changed in 3.5.5 and 3.6.2. because now what we do is we actually wait for the amount of time set by the max wait for connection parameter before issuing a timeout exception rather than a no host available exception. So just to reiterate, if you sort of run into this case anymore, you won't get this sort of flood of NHAs. What will happen is if the driver can reconnect within the max wait for connection time, then essentially you'll just proceed as normal. You won't get any exceptions. But if you cannot get a connection within that time, then you'll see this timeout exception that, like the one you see on the right of the screen here. And another thing you might notice is that this causes the driver's main thread to block when you submit queries. So because before how it worked was like if the host was marked as unavailable, you would just sort of immediately get an NHA, whereas now you actually do the wait. So this is an issue that we are aware of, and we'll have this likely solved in a future release so that this sort of submit is actually async. And if we move to the next slide, this is a sort of a more closer look at the stack trace that you would get from the timeout exception. So what we've tried to do is we've tried to add some more diagnostic information to the exception to make it easier to debug. So if you take a look at that highlighted portion, the driver, it now tries to include a potential cause for why you are seeing this error. So in this example here, you can see that you got a timeout exception because the connection was refused, which probably means the server was actually down. And so here, what we're looking at is a snippet of the log of when you get a timeout exception. So the error value for logging now has sort of additional information to help it make it easier for you to diagnose any issues with the connections. You can sort of use this information to determine what the state of the driver is when you ran into that timeout exception. And so in this simple example here, you can see that there's only one connection to the connection pool, and that connection is alive. And there's also nothing in the bin that's no connections in the bin that are going to be recycled. And so if we, so here's a list of some, noteworthy changes in TinkerPop 3.5.5 and 3.6.2 that we won't be covering in detail today. As always, you can find this information in the changelog and upgrade documentation. And so now I'll pass it off to Valentyn to give you a sneak peek TinkerPop 3.7.
I would like to review what we can expect in the next major version update. A small improvement is the ability to use step E in the middle of traversal, not just at the beginning as it used to be. For instance, this allows you to create queries like create if not exist, as shown in the code example. This feature is already implemented. Next slide, please. Main feature for now is properties on elements. The history of serialization of properties is quite long and confusing, but now only references are returned. Reference is ID and label of elements. In some use cases, it's much more convenient to get all properties at once, which is why this task arose. In the update, users will be able to control whatever they want to get properties or not. The screenshot shows example of executing the same code on different versions of the Gremlin server. Now this feature is in review. There are also other interesting features in progress, so stay tuned. And I would like to hand back to Yang.
Okay, thank you, Valentyn, and thank you, Ken and Co. So and now, thank you for everyone here. We're gonna open up the question period. So, is there any questions from the crowd? Oh, we got one. So is there any ability to send custom user agents with requests? So I believe that's a question for Cole.
Yeah, I can talk about a bit. So the answer is sort of a yes and a no. So the default user agent we've added here, currently it's not something you can customize beyond turning it on or turning it off. But you can still send a user agent on a per request basis, either by adding it as a request argument or using a with step in your Gremlin script. And then in that case, you can just attach any string you want as your user agent. So that's how it works for now. If there's enough interest in being able to customize the default one, which is sent during the WebSocket handshake, just during the connection request, yeah, just if that's something you're interested in, just reach out, and if there's enough interest, that's something we can probably make happen.
Okay, thank you, Cole. Let's see. Oh, so here's a question. I guess that's for me. Are there any possibility to extend the Dockerized integration test to start testing in a broader range of environment? Yeah, definitely. We believe that Dockerization provide a huge opportunity to expand it. So we're definitely, like I said before, we're looking to not only include testing and also building of all the GLVs and potentially, include, so right now it's only for the GLVs, but potentially we could also add, some Java integration tests into it and just test the different, test the mismatched driver and server version interactions and potentially, so I think Cole mentioned previously about how we can use user agent as a way to determine, I guess, mismatch version of and how that interacts, and then we can actually, put that test into a Docker environment. And yeah, and then I think anything to add, guys? I think for the Windows user, I think there's still certain, I guess, limitations, I think, in Windows, where you need a Docker desktop in order to enable using Linux images. So that's something we're looking to do in the future. But I believe currently, at least I think for Ken and Valentyn, I believe they develop on Windows. So yeah, it's working pretty well for them to be able to run Docker. So hopefully, that serves a convenience for developers out there. Thank you. Oh, okay. So a question for Ken. In what scenarios are we most likely to see a no-host available exception after these changes? Ken?
Yeah. So we've sort of replaced the no host available exception with that sort of timeout exception I was talking about earlier. No host available now is sort of only going to be thrown during initial connection pool setup. So it's only right at the beginning, when you first try to create the connection pool, that if that does not succeed, then you'll see the no host available. Otherwise, you're going to get that sort of timeout exception instead, like I was trying to explain before. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Oh, okay. So we have the Docker desktop now requires subscription. How would this work with the new requirement of Docker? Yeah, that's an unfortunate fortunate or unfortunate for us. It's not, but for the running, we actually just require the Docker daemon, which does not require subscription. So basically, you're able to run this just installing the Docker daemon without the convenience of like user interface of the Docker desktop. However, like I mentioned before, that is not the case for Windows users because I believe you still require the Docker desktop for the ability to use Linux container. Correct me if I'm wrong. That's true, right, Ken? I think. Or
yeah, pretty much, because you have either the WSL or the sort of VM option on Windows.
On one, yeah.
Yeah. So
okay.
you essentially kind of need Docker desktop.
So yeah, unfortunately, but yeah, but we support. So this is fully functional with just the Docker daemons. We've ran this on EC2 machines that you can just install and Maven clean install. Also, yeah, and also there's the Podman who that's recent. It's a potential direction to use Podman, which it's a similar to Docker containerized environment to use. Yeah. Any other questions? Will property on elements feature open up other use cases? Valentyn, let's say.
Out of the box, properties on elements will simplify some development because you can just get properties on elements. Also, it's open up some use cases for GLVs related to some graphs and trees. One more option is export-related stuff. You can easily export part of graph with properties on elements.
Okay. Given the changes for no host available exception, should I expect to change my code or driver configurations at all? I think Ken again.
So for the no host available changes, you don't need to change your code in order to get those sort of enhancements of where it works with temporary sort of errors that you're seeing that would have caused no host available before. You don't need to make any code changes to that. That was all done on the Java driver side, and so that part you don't need to change. But the part that got modified is the timeout exceptions. They sort of obey the max wait for connection parameter. So whereas before, even if you had tweaked that, it really wouldn't have done anything because you would just immediately got an NHA. Now you can actually change that configuration, and those things will actually sort of get obeyed now. So yeah, you can change your driver configurations to sort of change the behavior of that timeout exception. But no, you don't need to change your code if all you wanted was just the sort of fix for how the handling of temporary errors worked. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah, so I guess now in a way I should expect the expected behavior of the code now, which is the timeout to be obeyed. Okay, I think that's something to keep in mind. What are the performance implications of using properties on elements? Okay, that's a question for Valentyn. Okay.
Properties on elements require careful approach because for some graphs with fat properties, it can lead to performance degradation. Properties on elements can be disabled for some request or on server side. So it depends on queries.
Right. So I guess, the good thing is that we do have the option to not have it return properties. Is it? Yeah. So like if it return, so, if you have a fat vertices, we would imagine it would impact performance if you were to get the properties, right? But, if we don't, SR, you're saying? You're going to say something? Yeah. Okay, cool. So, yeah, I think that was also the reason it wasn't implemented in the beginning, right? Like for for sake of potential performance degradation. But I think with the implementation, there's with the opportunities it opens, it'll be a cool feature in the future. But yeah, okay. Thank you. I think we see all the questions are addressed. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today. We're happy to have presented our work, and then thanks to Ken, Cole, Valentyn, the modulators of the chat, and all the participants. And we hope to see you again in our next series. Thank you.
Thanks.